You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello, and welcome to Lockdown, hosted by Steve Bomford with Mike Davis-Marks. Our armed forces operate in challenging environments. Week by week, we'll explore what we can learn from their experiences.
Morning, Steve. I gather you found someone in the Royal Navy I don't know.
I have, I think, but, you know, we never know. You might be able to say, oh, I remember meeting him now. But it's a young man, Oliver Brown, Ollie Brown, who I think you'll find, or will agree, is quite an interesting young man.
Well, we better listen to it then.
We certainly had. Ollie, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
No, thank you very much.
So there's a little bit of a story here. You got introduced to me by a lady called Bex Fines, who, as you know, has been a guest on our podcast and has, in fact, introduced us to lots of people. And she said that you had a bit of a story and that you'd put a couple of posts on, I think it was LinkedIn and Twitter, and they essentially went viral. So I think you've got a bit of a story to tell us. You're in the Royal Navy, so tell us a little bit about that so people know who you are, and then let's hear what you've got to say.
Yes, thanks, Steve. So I joined the Royal Navy just over 10 years ago as a warfare officer. Joined straight from college, didn't go to university. Navigated mine hunters, commanded the P2000, and was flag lieutenant to the 2nd Sea Lord and 1st Sea Lord. So had a bit of a varied and interesting career. But part of that journey was ultimately leading to that point of putting those posts that Bex mentioned to you on social media. Everyone talks about themselves on social media all the time. You just don't quite expect the level of response. And the main one that you mentioned there, LinkedIn, had 2.6 million views, which you sort of go, wow. I remember bumping into someone in the Navy soon after that happened. They said, oh, what did you get? 200,000, 300,000 views. So even people didn't expect the level of interest. And what was that post about? Well, quite simply, HIV. I have HIV. I've been living with HIV for 2 years, and I serve a full career in the Navy with HIV. But it's not that simple. And that's what the post and the whole journey is about, really. That living with HIV in the military isn't simple. It isn't straightforward. But equally, living with HIV, whilst medically simple, is not easy for anyone.
So I'm going to ask you, how did you contract HIV? What's the story there? Because it's not, again, this is not as straightforward as people might at first assume. So it's really, as having spent a lot of time talking to you about this before we did this, and I'm guilty of this completely, it's really easy to make lots of assumptions, isn't it? And I think we probably, or rather you probably need to challenge a few of those for us.
So how did you contract it is that big question for people living with HIV. The best way to sum it up is quite often it's a no-go question for people, and it's comparable to, comparable to asking someone in the military, how many people have you killed? It's of that gravity because the answer is quite similar. Sometimes you never actually know. HIV is a strange virus when it's in your system. You can't date how long it's been there. So I don't know where I got it from. There's no particular incident, etc., that sparks out as that's how I got it. All I know for truth is when I found out about it, which equally, because I'm not considered at risk and I don't live in a major city, HIV testing isn't readily available or offered. So I was cycling in London. I came off my bike, ended up going into a brick wall, and went to A&E as a result of that. It just so happened that the hospital that I went to did opt out HIV testing. So any bloods that they took in A&E as a trial, they were testing for HIV. So that's how I found out of the blue, not expecting it due to some other circumstance being tested for it. Generally, quite simply, most people catch HIV through sex. It's as simple as that. Yes, you can catch it through infected blood. There is a community in the UK which had it through blood transfusions and treatment for haemophilia. You can, but it's quite difficult to get it through needle stick injuries or sharing of needles because of the way that we now approach that. And there are various other situations. You can't get it from kissing. You can't get it from sharing a mug. You can't get it from holding hands. All of those misnomers that were around in the 1980s, it just doesn't happen. You need three things. You need a good quality of virus, you need a good quantity of the virus, and you need an effective transmission route. And that is generally body fluid to body fluid, direct transmission of those fluids. So saliva doesn't have the first two, but it could eventually with the route. So you don't have all three, it's not going to transmit. So that's the simple way. If you don't have all three, which the environment has to be very stable, it's not going to happen. So how did I get it? We'll never truly know. Equally, you could be asking someone, how did you get it? And it could be a result of a sexual harassment or rape. It could be that they've had it from birth. I think the biggest thing overall for me, that it doesn't matter how you got it. There's no better or worse version of HIV. There are just people living with HIV.
Because it's a pretty unpleasant disease, obviously, isn't it? And I think people, because of that, I think you're right, referring back to the 80s when there was some pretty hard-hitting campaigning, probably rightly so, I guess, at the time to raise awareness, is that a lot of people still, including me probably, have that kind of perception. And I think things have moved on enormously, haven't they? So I think what you're saying here is that you can live with this and lead a full life. Am I right in saying that?
Completely. I take one tablet a day, and that takes my HIV to what they refer as undetectable. So when they do a blood test, I'm below a certain level, it is ultimately undetectable. And they use the phrase undetectable equals untransmittable. I cannot physically pass HIV on to anyone. What effect does it have on my life? Well, there's actually an idea that my life expectancy is greater than a normal person. Because I have HIV, I pay closer attention to my health. I have to have regular checkups with doctors and almost have a HIV MOT, as some people call it. So that is a double-edged sword. Yes, it's not a great thing to have HIV, but it means that I'm more conscious and could live longer than a normal person. But comparing it to other chronic conditions, HIV is barely life-limiting. And when I say life-limiting, that's not about how long you live, that's the way you live your life. There's so many different types of medication you can be on that it makes it most comfortable for you, minimal side effects, least interactions. There's nothing in my diet I have to avoid, etc. So actually, other than that one tablet a day that reminds me of it, I don't deal with HIV, as it were, in any other part of my life.
Just want to come back to the moment you found out. How did you react to that? I mean, you obviously weren't expecting it. So I can't imagine that was like great news at the time. So how did you react?
There's sort of two things. When they first were doing the tests, they were actually testing for if I had the early stages of cancer. And not that I knew what HIV meant at that point, but my actual reaction, I said to the doctor, well, at least it's not cancer. Because I had those images of chemotherapy, etc., and the horrible tests and trials you go through with cancer. But that was my knee-jerk response. Then I started to think, okay, what is HIV? And for me, it goes back to Rent the Musical. That was my last contact, understanding, or education about HIV. So first three thoughts was, what is my life going to be like? When am I going to die? And do I still have a job? Which are pretty hard-hitting three thoughts.
There are some pretty profound questions there, aren't there?
Yeah. Those first two, within the first 2 hours, you're bombarded with information. And I'll always remember being given this booklet, which I've still got at home, which is almost like a kid's cartoon book. It's got like a child's illustration book. And I look back and go, well, actually, that's what taught me what HIV is. And you're in such a state of shock. The best way to process it is like you're teaching a toddler.
Right.
and it's got a picture of a dog chasing its tail. And that's how they explain to you how HIV is in your system. You're effectively chasing a tail to try and eradicate it constantly, but it's at such a minute level. It's got loads of pictures like this that you go, well, they're a bit childish. Well, I wouldn't have understood it if they weren't. So the first two were dealt with. I realized quite rapidly, I'm not going to die. And that's the simple fact of HIV for people in the UK today. What's my life going to be like? As I said, no limit. I can do whatever I want, and I put no one else at risk. The third one wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. How often do we talk about HIV in the military? Well, other than an inappropriate joke here or there, it's probably never mentioned. So when I spoke to my line manager, Captain Sarah Oakley, wonderful conversation, but still the conversation was, I'm not sure, we're going to have to find out. So that, okay, so what, hung around for a while.
Can I ask, so are you the first person that raised this as an issue? So said, I'm HIV positive, or has it not happened before or just people not aware?
So it has happened before. There are others in the military. The policy is there. Where do you find the policy? Even when you speak to the medical community, when was the last time they had to look at HIV? There's thousands of medical situations they could have to deal with. HIV, working out a ratio from the amount of people in the country with HIV down to the military, there should be enough people across defence in uniform to crew a Type 45 destroyer. So that's to say circa 250 people. So the likelihood of a doctor in the military having seen, spoken to, or dealt with someone with HIV, or even a line manager, is unlikely. So it's their personal experience as to whether they understand. Ultimately, after speaking to all the various points of contact, we got to the answer, well, actually, yes, you can stay in, but you'll be medically limited deployable.
What does that mean?
So in practice as a warfare officer, in reality, not much. Actually, it's just there to give me a risk assessment to make sure that I've got medication before I go away, and it doesn't stop me going anywhere. The limitations for other services and other branches would mean that in the army, particularly in the land dominant force, they would be confined to the rear echelon. So not out right up at the front fighting in the field. So an infantry's career has now significantly shifted direction. But that medically limited deployable reality wasn't the issue. It was the mental impact that I sort of started to think about, okay, hang on a minute. And throughout all this journey of people not understanding HIV truly, through to starting to delve into and dig into the policies, that led me to turn around to defence and go, why? Is this right? And as you unpick it more and more, you realise, well, actually, there isn't a medical reason why I should be limited deployable. I'm actually safer to deploy in every circumstance because you know I have HIV, and that's the reason you're limiting me. How often does someone test for HIV in the military? Well, I've been in 10 years and had one test, and that was through personal choice, not through military need. There is no compulsory testing because that's unethical. So actually, we don't know if you join the military, if you have HIV, because we don't test. We then don't routinely test throughout the career. So when you deploy a group of personnel into the field, you don't know who has HIV, if they do or if they don't. But the person that does know and can't pass it on isn't allowed to go into the field. So I started challenging that logic. And the biggest part of that medically limited deployable was the mental impact. You're telling me that because I have HIV, I'm limited in the way I do my job. But I'm not. But this thing that I've had to deal with and struggle with mentally, you're saying is what is the problem.
So what were those impacts on your mental health, Ollie?
So it took a year before actually I accepted those impacts. So diagnosed in 2019, I was working for Her Sea Lord at the time, which was the perfect distraction from everything. Eventually, I can only explain it as I hit a brick wall when I realized the reality that I had created two versions of myself. And every time I went out into work or into public, I put a mask on. And the tension between that mask and me broke. I completely lost control, realized that I didn't know what was going on with me. Whilst I knew everything scientifically and medically about HIV, I wasn't in a good place. So I ended up being downgraded with depression and anxiety, on medication, and went through counselling. That was the start, and that was a year ago. I could say that right now I'm still on medication and I'm still going through counselling. Just unpicking what I described at the beginning of when I was asked, what is HIV to me and what do I think about HIV? All that came to mind was a tangled ball of string, to the point that I didn't even know where to start untangling it. It just existed. I have HIV. There's the ball of string. What does it mean? I have HIV. Don't know. I've now unraveled that and started to understand it more and more and make more sense of that. But then you start facing the, okay, right, whilst HIV to me is now, I say it's insignificant, but it's also important. I've got a tattoo on my big toe of a red ribbon. My brother's a tattoo artist, and he once asked me, well, what is HIV to you? And I said, oh, it's no bigger or smaller than my big toe. So he turned around and said, right, so let's tattoo a red ribbon on your big toe. And it's that subtle messaging that actually HIV is as small as my big toe, but actually if you lose your big toe, you can't walk. So it's important, but it's not. And then how do I see my life in HIV? Well, actually, I don't need to hide it behind a wall, but I don't need to immerse myself in it. So I see that now I walk along the top of a brick wall where HIV is one side and my life's the other. You can't ignore it because actually it eats away because you've got this secret that you don't want to tell people. And that's why actually 1 in 4 people living with HIV has depression or anxiety. 40% of people in the UK living with HIV have asked for mental health support. And the important part of that figure is 40% have asked for help. So many haven't. You're also twice as likely to commit suicide with HIV than without. So I'll openly say, yes, I have contemplated suicide, because you're in such a place of not knowing how to deal with something that the words dirty, promiscuous, dangerous, infectious can be thrown at you incorrectly at any point. And that's what you're constantly struggling with.
So those are quite harsh words for sure for anybody, no matter what their circumstances. And I think this ball of string's a really good metaphor. So you talk about unraveling it. It wasn't that long ago, as you've already said. So how did you do that? What did you do to kind of bring us up to date, I guess? Because you haven't just kept that little ball tangled up, have you?
No. So I came to terms with my HIV in quite a dramatic way, for want of a better way of doing it. I felt that no one else should feel as alone and isolated as I did. I can't be the only person in the military with HIV. Well, where are they? So we're not in a comfortable environment to talk about it, and that's not going to change unless you make it change. So I spoke out in defence with the Candid Network, the Chronic Conditions and Disabilities in Defence Network, and spoke to over 100 people about living with HIV. And I didn't hold back in challenging those questions of why can't you serve a full career? Why can't you join? Why can't you take PrEP, which is a positive health choice to avoid you having a transmission of HIV if you're uninfected? So why are we in this situation, and what can we do about it? From talking to those 100 people, it was just a snowball effect. I worked with the Terence Higgins Trust, and started to ask more and more questions about HIV and defence and the processes. This ultimately ended up getting the attention of the Government Equalities Office, Number 10, and Central Defence. And once you started challenging more and more, admittedly, I originally said this is going to take 3 to 4 years. We need to work through this. Well, sooner or later, we actually realised, no, it doesn't need to take 3 to 4 years. We just need to get on with this. And 6 months later, after various conversations, discussions, and just shining a spotlight on the policies and going, you need to look here. On the 1st of December, Defence announced that you can join the military and have no impact of being in the military if you take PrEP. And that as of spring this year, when it comes to living with HIV and joining with HIV in the military, those restrictions will be lifted. That is where ultimately I then did the post on social media, which all of those pieces then got obviously the media's attention. And I was saying to my counsellor recently, what better way of coming to terms with your HIV than telling 10 million people? Because I've said so many things about HIV, I've talked about it, but it wasn't until after the 1st of December that I went, actually, I'm believing what I'm saying myself. And I openly say, I've got 28 years of stigma and 2 years of understanding. I thought those things about someone like me 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it was right, but I was stigmatized. So I'm still repairing 28 years of misunderstanding. And that's why actually I realized that, as you mentioned, there was a government campaign of information in the 80s. That was the right thing to do there and then, because actually that's the reality. People needed to know to stop it becoming too large a thing. But where has the correction of that information to that scale happened? And if I, as a member of the military, which generally people don't talk about or think about HIV in, can stand up and go, I'm here, I have HIV, that is a step in the right direction of people learning and understanding about it.
Mm. That's true. Do you think that COVID, which is a virus, as we know, has that kind of made it easier to talk about it? Because we all of a sudden, we're all kind of like, we're all mini sort of COVID experts, aren't we? In terms of it's been so much there. And I think it's certainly pushed, health and well-being quite high up the agenda, even if it's in terms of, the strains the NHS are under, the impact on work, etc. Has that kind of unexpectedly kind of created a window that people are perhaps more receptive to talking about things like this?
I think in a way it has, because people understand that journey of fear and lack of understanding. Back when COVID started, did we understand how it transmitted? No. Back when HIV started, did we understand? No. The ideas of how HIV was transmitted in the beginning were as erratic as COVID was. I think the bit that you will always have a subconscious reaction of, you can get COVID walking down the street. You can get COVID sitting in a restaurant.
Yeah.
I've seen it said to people on documentaries and various things and in conversation, oh, well, it's your fault you put yourself in that situation with HIV. It's almost, some people feel that if you've got HIV, you went out to get it. You were in such a situation that you caused it for yourself. It's your fault. It's not a blame game.
So are you saying that's like a life? Some people, and I'm pretty sure I've heard this before actually, that people are saying it's a lifestyle choice in some ways, as a way of blaming, as you put it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I almost say to some people, it's a lifestyle choice. Well, I don't think it's a lifestyle choice to be raped, which actually could be a reason for someone getting HIV.
Yeah.
Is it a lifestyle choice that you're a haemophiliac and when they were going through the early stages of treatment, they weren't cleansing the blood? Is that a lifestyle choice? I think that they didn't have a choice. Is it your fault that you were born to a parent that had HIV and they didn't know, and because they didn't know and weren't medicated and supported, you got it at birth? Oh, it's clearly your lifestyle choice. So there's so many situations that it could be. Actually, it's just part of life.
Mm. So you haven't sort of rested on your laurels with any of this. What are you currently hoping to achieve? What are you currently working on?
Well, so part of me says it never stops. There's always something else. So there's always 2 times a year that HIV sort of goes into the spotlight. And on the 7th of February this year is National HIV Testing Week. So you are able to get a free test from startswithme.org.uk. And it's as simple as a drop of blood or a swab of saliva from your mouth. That is an on-the-spot HIV test. And anything I can do to raise the profile of that week. And the simple part is, don't look at it as if you think you're at risk or you're not at risk. Think, do you know your status? Do you know if you're positive or negative? Well, I can confidently say I'm positive. Can anyone listening to this confidently say they're negative, other than, oh, no, I've not been exposed. Oh, there's no reason. Well, oddly enough, before I was diagnosed, I thought I was negative. So if you haven't had a test, you can't say if you're negative confidently. So don't go, oh, do I need to? Just do it. What difference can it make? I can stand here and say that actually, yes, I'm HIV positive. What difference does it make? Well, nothing. I take a tablet every day. So there's nothing to be scared of. And yes, it's quite a journey to process, but that's life. There's always things that take time to process. But if you get that positive result, it doesn't change anything. And actually, there are so many people out there in the HIV community who will jump up to support and defend you. Whether you decide to live quietly and tell no one or 1 or 2 people, or go to the other extreme and stand on the rooftops and tell everyone just to battle that stigma, that doesn't matter. The important part is knowing your status. And then moving forward long term, where else is there stigma? There are other situations like there's a question on the DVLA form when you renew your driving license about if you've got AIDS. You can't box in the UK if you have HIV, but you can do every other contact sport. And there's rules around surrogacy that are arguably outdated due to medical science. So actually, I'm going to carry on working with the Terence Higgins Trust, but also with the military to challenge these rules of other organisations, but within the military, to promote that idea of what's going on. Let's have a positive attitude towards sexual health and change the way that we approach and think about things.
So not much then?
No, just a small list. Yeah.
So you sent me some links through actually before, as we've been talking by email and calls before we did this. So what's the benefit of looking at these websites, do you think, in terms of, so just take them one at a time. So you've talked about the Terence Higgins Trust, which I think my knowledge probably extends to the Red Ribbon. I might even be wrong about that. So what do they do, and how, in a bit more detail, please, and what can people do to look after themselves?
So Terence Higgins Trust is the UK's largest HIV charity. Terry Higgins was one of the first people to die of AIDS in the UK. And the people around him went, right, let's do something about this. And they set up the Terence Higgins Trust as a central point to support people with HIV, but also advocate for people with HIV. They work a lot alongside the National AIDS Trust, which is the sort of the other big charity giant. So Terence Higgins Trust was where I did my counselling first. So actually they provide counselling for people living with HIV. They do workshops to help people understand their HIV. They also do things like they've got the Positive Voices programme, which I'm part of, which is a group of people living with HIV that go and speak with businesses, schools, and all sorts of areas about HIV and what it means. And they effectively provide all these services to fight the stigma around HIV, but also support those that are on their journey dealing with that stigma. And it was the Terence Higgins Trust that I started working through with all of this.
So this would be for people that might be struggling a bit with their mental health as well, not just as the physical manifestation of the infection.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So Terence Higgins Trust cover all sorts of provision for that, all the way through to you've got THT Direct, which is a help desk, which anyone can phone and go, oh, I think I've been exposed to HIV, or hi, I just want to know more about HIV, all the way through to someone with HIV in their darkest places going, I don't know what to do. And they can signpost to all of the provisions that they have developed over time to then help people, whether they're living with HIV, a family member of someone with HIV, or literally think that, well, random questions like, I know that they've had the question of, oh, I've just touched a door handle with some blood on it. Am I at risk of having HIV? Oddly enough, no. Or I've cleaned up someone's vomit off the floor. I know they have HIV. Is it a problem? No. But it's a phone number that you can just ask those questions and get that help from, an idea of what's going on.
So that all has to be a good thing. And then you've got It Starts With Me, which is this testing, isn't it? Do you want to, what do people need to do? Or is it only available from certain dates, so on and so forth? We can, of course, with all of this, include links within the podcast description, so listeners can just head to the description and click on them. But tell us a bit more, please, about Starts With Me.
So Starts With Me, every year there is 1 week of a national testing drive. And you can order the tests, I think it's about 1 or 2 weeks prior and throughout that week. And you can then get sent to your home an HIV test, which practically looks like a COVID test. It pretty much looks like they're very similar, the two lines, which we're all now familiar with. And there's sort of two main versions of the test. One, which is a small prick of blood, which it then detects whether there's HIV in your system. And there is a saliva swab, which is another type of test, which some people prefer because they don't like the blood idea. So 2 simple tests, and you literally sit there and watch it, and it will show whether you're positive or negative. That's a contact test, and as soon as that has come through, it's got all the information and numbers to phone if you get a positive result, so that all the support can be wrapped around you and everything can be sorted for you. Because then they subsequently do a confirmatory test to go, right, do you definitely, let's make sure that first test is what it indicated. So actually that just makes sure that everything is in place, because the amount of blood tests when you identified as HIV positive is astronomical. You felt like there's nothing left in you, because that's how they work out the medication and things, to work out exactly how the HIV is and your blood is, to target it in the best way. So that is the Starts With Me campaign. That 1 week, as I say, unless you can tell me with absolute conviction, which the only way you could do it is you've had an HIV test and then you've been sexually abstained from sex for many years, post that, you cannot confidently tell me that you're 100% negative. So what harm is there in getting a test?
None whatsoever, it would seem. And this is a national testing week, is that right? Have I got that right? It's very small on the website.
Yeah,
the
that's
date.
correct.
And that's tiny. 7th of February, if I got that right?
7th of February. Yes, 7th of February is the start date of it. And it goes through all the information there, of information about HIV, do's and don'ts around best way to protect yourself from HIV, and signposting to various other information sources. It's all there, and effectively it's a joint campaign with all of the HIV charities and everything to try and just, if we're going to reach the 2030 target, which is to have 0 transmissions by 2030, we need to find everyone living with HIV. That's quite a mission. Find everyone, and the closer we get to 2030, the harder it's going to be, because we need to find absolutely every person. So everyone needs to go out and try and test. And the biggest part I'd say of this is, you can't assume it's not you.
Yeah.
I've been asked the question in the past, is this indicative of your lifestyle? Is it lifestyle? Okay, right. So what lifestyles do we think HIV affects? So are you saying, am I gay? Am I bisexual? Am I a man who has sex with men? Am I an injecting drug user? Am I promiscuous, negligent in my sexual behaviors? Do I engage with sex workers in foreign nations? Well, which one are you trying to say I am? The bit I'd highlight of that is in 2020, those who were diagnosed with HIV, 50% were heterosexual, 45% were homosexual, 28% were women. So actually, is it indicative of your lifestyle? No, it's not. The clue's in the name. Human immunodeficiency virus. That's what it's there for. Mm. So just think about it and get tested.
So I think the key message here is to everybody, this is not about whether you serve in the Royal Navy, this is for the entire society, is to, if practical, get a test because it's extremely important. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Makes perfect sense. I've got one final question for you, Ollie. You've done an awful lot in a very, very small amount of time. What are your plans for the future?
My plans for the future almost sit with the same mantra that I had for my plans in the past, and it's to make a difference for one person. If I can be set a challenge, all I need to do is make a difference for one person. So already I'm in conversations with American military veterans who the American military rules around HIV are where ours were, if not worse. They still have criminalization of HIV in US military legislation at the far extreme. So for me, that's one thing, that I can help one person. And equally, since speaking out, there's so many opportunities coming up that I could just want to do more and more, but more so prove what I've said by living a full career. What better proof is it than me going, I'm a lieutenant commander serving in the Royal Navy, serving a full capable career. Oh, by the way, I have HIV.
I like that answer. I think, the Royal Navy has got a great young officer and they would be unfortunate to lose you, in my humble opinion. But I have zero power or any of that is concerned, let's be absolutely clear.
Yeah.
So that's just my little opinion. So, Ollie, I would like to say thank you so much because I know, you've touched on some pretty serious issues. It's deeply personal to you. It goes without saying. And just thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, Mike, was I right? Is he an interesting young man?
We were both right. I have not met him before. And yes, you're right. He's an extremely interesting young man with a very interesting story to tell. In fact, one I'd not heard before in the context of serving in the armed forces.
No, and I think that's his whole motivation, isn't it, to share that story?
It is. I tell you, I'm really quite staggered by the variety and diversity of the guests that you get onto this podcast series, because we have covered some really wide range of ground in terms of people's backgrounds, circumstances, impacts and things like that. And this is just another one.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to think of the Royal Navy or any reasonably large organisation as a homogenous group of people that do naval things, whatever that means. But when you start digging down and actually meeting all the individuals that make up an organisation, I think diversity is the word, isn't it? Diversity is the word.
I mean, I suppose, the stereotype of a sailor in the Royal Navy is what they used to display on those cigarette cards, like Jolly Jack Tar and things like that. And I'm pleased to say that the Navy I was proud to be part of is so much more than that. It's so much more diverse, and it gets more and more diverse with time. So I think it's fantastic that it can accommodate everybody and have such a diverse, because I believe that diversity equals creativity and a much better perspective on life.
Well, yes, if we were all identical, life would be very boring indeed, wouldn't it?
Boring and almost certainly wrong. Problem solving is not very good if everyone shares the same view as one person. So we're enriched by diversity in problem solving, in going about our daily lives, and in working together in a collaborative style.
Yes. So speaking of different views, what's your take on Ollie?
Well, first, I must put my hand up, like I think you did during the interview, and say that I'm guilty of making lots of assumptions about HIV and people with HIV. And the podcast was extremely educational and bust a few of those assumptions, rightly so. So my view is, what a fantastic person, a standard bearer for the cause, and he's not sitting on his hands, sort of licking his wounds. Not that there are any wounds to lick. He's been extremely proactive, and I think almost the last thing he said was he wants to make a difference, to at least one person. I suspect he's going to do it to many more than one person.
I completely agree, and I think it's just such a refreshing attitude and approach to have, isn't it? Because, as you say, it would be so easy to sort of look inwards, wouldn't it? Where he's taken completely a different perspective and look outwards. How can I make a change, and what does that look like? Yeah,
that makes him an ambassador in many senses of the word. His story is really. He's been in the Navy for 10 years. He's a lieutenant warfare officer. I know what that feels like. I was once, many years ago. But he only discovered that he was HIV positive 2 years ago out of accident, having a bike accident in London. There might be some, riding a bike in London does require a certain amount of bravery anyway. But it led to one hospital doing an opt-out policy on HIV testing, and to his complete and utter surprise, he found he was positive. He had no idea that was even a possibility at that stage.
No, well, I think that, that must be true for all of us, because I think a key part of what he was saying was that you don't know how you catch it or where it may come from. It may come from, many other sources apart from the sort of stereotypical.
I think that was one of the assumptions that was busted during this interview. I thought his reaction to finding out was quite interesting. The first thing was he was glad it wasn't cancer. So at least it's not cancer, I think he said. And then he did what is this thing? What is HIV? What is my life going to be like? When am I going to die? And have I still got a job? And I suppose that if you don't know much about the virus, then that's a pretty common reaction, to be honest. And I think what was encouraging was actually he worked out very quickly, there was information that his life wouldn't change that much, physically at least. He wasn't going to die prematurely. In fact, he made an argument that actually he was likely to have a greater life expectancy than normal because he'll take care of himself, he has more regular checkups, etc. But I think the big question mark was, so how does this affect my job? The good news, of course, is he's still in the Royal Navy as an ambassador for this, and that means that his job is still good, and he's looking forward to a full career. That's one of his visions.
Yeah, and I would argue an asset to the Royal Navy as well. But I must admit, getting all that news and having to deal with all the, your health, your job, must have been really tough for him, really tough.
And also being the first person to speak about it so publicly, because as he opined, there might be something in the region of 250 people who are HIV positive in the armed forces, on numbers, on a statistical basis. But either they don't know it, that's probably the majority, or if they do know it, they're not talking about it. So I think he's very brave to talk about it and to raise the profile of it, make it okay to speak out about it, but also to look at what the armed forces are doing in terms of policy and challenge it where it's outdated, which what he said is in many cases was the case. And so he's making a difference already by challenging policy and getting it to be more consistent.
Yeah, I think you're right. Courage is the word here. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to speak out about, many subjects, but this subject in particular. And I think all power to him.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, one of the interesting things he says on the physical side, he takes a tablet a day, and that's it. There's no other side effects or anything like that. So physically, he's no different to not being HIV positive. But I think, and this is where the company makers, comes in so strongly. He started talking about the mental impact and the fact he is on counselling still, and he has to take medication for the mental aspects of it. I think that's the bit that that's the unhidden bit of all of this. That's the hidden bit of all of this, and I think that I'm so glad he came on to talk about that.
Yes, because as we've talked about before, mental health challenges, not everybody is confident enough to want to actually talk about it, and I think that's something that he has managed to achieve for sure.
And I'm sure that's therapeutic in its own right.
Yeah.
I mean, he used a metaphor, a tangled ball of string, which he needs to unravel. And I thought that was a lovely phrase in terms of describing, what was going on inside his head mentally. And actually, he recognises that the mental impact is probably, for most people, the stigma that is attached to this, and the mental impact of that is probably the greater of all of the things that affect people that have HIV.
Yeah, and I think, we live in quite a sort of, social media is not exactly a warm, cosy place, is it, to be sharing stories like this? So I think it does, you hear all sorts about trolls and things like that. Not everyone's going to respond favourably, I'm sure. So not only does it take courage to talk about it, it takes courage to put it on social media as well. And
get a response like he did. I think he said when he posted it in December, he got a 2.6 million views. I mean, that's an extraordinary response. It just shows you that actually it's something that's just beneath the surface that people really want to know more about. Actually, funny enough, there was a program on TV about a year ago now called It's a Sin, made by the great Russell T Davies, which looked back at the early 80s when AIDS and HIV was just starting to become in. And of course, in those days, it really was stereotyped horrendously. And the TV series made a very good way of demonstrating that ignorance and what people went through. And I'm glad to say that we have moved on since then.
Yeah, yes, I've seen that program, and it was the kind of almost the fear within the community, wasn't it? That was the thing I really took away from that program. Although it did it very well in terms of a drama, I think you're right. From that kind of terrifying advertising that we had when it became a public health issue, to the effect it has on the community from where we are today, you would never imagine that someone like Ollie would have been able to stand up, so to speak, and say what he said.
No, exactly. But aren't we pleased that he does, for the sake of everybody, both from those that haven't got it from an ignorance perspective and those that have got it to have the courage to do something more proactive about it.
We are indeed.
So I've got a question for you, Steve. Have you got a...
Oh, no.
Have you got a tattoo? And if so, is it on your big toe?
I'm not at liberty to... No, I have no tattoos. That's a really easy one to answer. If what about the one on your forearm that I've seen? Is that, or was I imagining that?
You are imagining it. I'm untattooed as well, but I quite like the idea of a discreet tattoo on a big toe. I thought that was quite neat, actually. And I suppose it helped if his brother is a tattoo artist. I don't have a brother that is proficient in the use of ink. Anyway, So he talked about what he's doing now. He talked about working with the Terence Higgins Trust, which we all know is the largest HIV charity in the UK. He's talking about, the Starts With Me campaign, which happens once a year in February. And he continues to be a crusader in defence in terms of challenging policies. He's also going across the pond to try and help the US military, who appear to be behind us in some respects in this, in the way that they treat HIV positive members of the armed forces, are helping them to make a difference as well.
Yeah, and I've seen him on Twitter challenging other organisations, an insurance company of all things, who will remain nameless, but he's very, very proactive, very proactive.
So here's a call out to our listeners. Be interesting to hear what your thoughts are on this subject. This is not often talked about. In fact, it's the first time we've really talked about it throughout this series. So if you've got an opinion on the stigma of HIV and how it should be dealt with, or people that you know that you've got HIV, please let us know through the usual social media channels. It'd be interesting to hear your views.
Absolutely. All the social media channels, as you put it, will be in the description below. So if you want to click on those and get involved in the conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, as he said, he can't be the only person in the armed forces HIV. Last thing, the statistics he gave you, 50% heterosexual, 45% homosexual, 20% women. I was completely gobsmacked by that. I had no idea. So I think that we all need to know what the facts are rather than just sort of make up things in our head, which we're very guilty of doing in many walks of life.
Yes, I think the key takeaway is it could affect anybody.
I'd like to end by saying, well done, Ollie. That was a great interview. I don't know you, but I think I'd like to get to know you.
I'll let him know. So when you're in Portsmouth next, we'll have a little gathering over cake. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity exists to support sailors, Marines and their families for life. If you or someone you know could do with some support, give them a call on 023 93 87 1568 or drop them an email on support@rnrmc.org.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, please subscribe.